Imagine the air in a Viking home. It was often so thick with smoke that you could preserve a leg of lamb just by hanging it from the ceiling. There were no windows, no chimney, and in the dead of winter, the family's cows and sheep were sleeping just a few feet away. To us, it sounds like a suffocating, unsanitary nightmare. But for the Norse, this smoky, crowded setup wasn't a sign of ignorance. It was a brilliant, multi-purpose survival machine. It was an ingenious solution to the relentless challenges of the unforgiving North. What we see as brutal, they saw as a competitive edge. Before we deep dive into the history, my name is Boris, and I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what was the best part of your day? Feel free to share it in the comments below. Now, settle in. Let's drift gently into the past. The Vikings. The name alone conjures images of ferocious warriors, horned helmets, which they didn't actually wear, by the way, and blood-soaked axes. Popular culture has painted them as one-dimensional berserkers, driven by a lust for gold and glory. But that image, as cool as it is dangerously incomplete. It's like judging a master surgeon by the blood on his apron, without understanding the life-saving procedure he just performed. The truth is, the Vikings were more than just raiders. They were farmers, explorers, engineers, poets, and merchants. But above all, they were survivors. They didn't just endure one of the planet's most punishing environments. They thrived in it. They built a society that dominated Northern Europe for 3 centuries, and they did it not through brute force alone, but through a unique and often misunderstood brand of genius. Their world demanded a different kind of logic, a pragmatism so extreme it can look like cruelty to us. Many of their daily habits, their laws, and their traditions seem savage, even monstrous. But if you dig underneath the surface, if you strip away 1,000 years of change and look at these practices in their proper context, you find something startling. You find a hidden logic, a brutal necessity, a stroke of genius disguised as barbarism. Today, we're peeling back the layers of myth. We're going to explore 5 Viking habits that seem utterly brutal, but were, in fact, brilliant solutions for surviving and succeeding in their harsh world. From how they built their homes to how they raised their children, we'll uncover the clever thinking behind the apparent cruelty. This is a journey into the mind of the Vikings, where survival wasn't just a goal, it was the ultimate art form. Imagine stepping into a Viking longhouse on a freezing winter day. The first thing that hits you isn't the warmth, but the smoke. It's everywhere. A thick grey haze hangs in the air, stinging your eyes and catching in your throat. There are no windows, just a small hole in the roof for the smoke from the central fire pit to escape. The light is dim, the air is acrid, and the smell is a potent mix of burning wood, unwashed bodies, cooking stew, and livestock. That's right. In one section of this long, narrow building, maybe separated by a simple wooden partition, are the family's most valuable animals: cows, sheep, and goats. They're living, breathing, and doing their business just a few feet from where the family eats, works, and sleeps. Privacy isn't a concept. Fresh air is a distant memory from summer. The floor is just packed earth. From our 21st century perspective, this is a public health crisis. It seems incredibly unsanitary and unhealthy, a breeding ground for respiratory illness and disease. Why would a people as hardy as the Vikings choose to live in what seems like a dark, suffocating barn? Because the longhouse wasn't a flaw. It was a masterpiece of passive engineering. Every single element that seems awful to us was a carefully balanced feature with a hidden, life-sustaining purpose. It was a self-sufficient ecosystem designed for maximum efficiency. Let's start with the smoke. That constant choking haze was actually one of the most ingenious parts of the design. While the fire provided heat and light, the smoke it produced was a powerful tool. As it filtered up to the roof, it permeated everything. Hanging from the rafters were large cuts of meat and fish. The smoky air cured them slowly and steadily, preserving a vital supply of protein for the lean, frozen months of winter. That toxic-seeming air was a giant walk-in smokehouse, ensuring the family wouldn't starve. But the smoke did more than that. The creosote and tar in it coated the timber beams of the longhouse, acting as a natural preservative against rot and decay. It also worked as a fantastic insect repellent in the summer, driving away flies and mosquitoes that carry disease. The smoke literally sanitized the living space. Now, what about the animals? Bringing livestock inside seems gross, but it was a stroke of survival genius. A cow generates a lot of body heat, basically a small space heater. Multiply that by a whole herd, and you have a massive source of passive heating at no extra cost in firewood. The animals were furry, milk-producing radiators that kept the family from freezing to death. And yes, there was manure, but even that was a resource, composted for fertilizing crops in the spring. The very shape of the longhouse, long, narrow, and curved like an upside-down boat, was brilliant. The low, curved roof minimized wind resistance against the northern gales, and the lack of windows prevented precious heat from escaping. So, the Viking longhouse, which seems like a primitive, miserable place to live, was actually a sophisticated, multifunctional system. It was a home, a barn, and a food preservation factory all in one. The smoke that stung your eyes also cured your meat, and the animals that shared your space also heated it. It wasn't about comfort, it was about the genius of resilience, a perfect answer to the brutal questions of the northern world. This next habit is probably the hardest one for us to understand, let alone accept. It goes against everything we believe about protecting the most vulnerable. In the pre-Christian Viking world, it was an accepted practice for a father to decide if a newborn baby would be raised or if it would be left outside to die. This was known as barna utburda, or carrying out a child. The ritual was chillingly formal. After a baby was born, it was placed on the floor. The father, as head of the household, would inspect it. If he decided the infant was strong, healthy, and without any obvious deformities, he would lift it up, claim it as his own, and give it a name. But if the child was born with a disability, seemed weak, or was simply born into a family that couldn't afford another mouth to feed, he could make a terrible decision. He could refuse to pick the child up. This was a death sentence. The baby would be taken from the home and left in the wilderness, on a mountain or in a forest, to die from the elements or be taken by animals. To us, this is unthinkable. It's sanctioned infanticide, an act of supreme brutality. It feels like the work of monsters. How could a society that created beautiful art and complex laws possibly condone something so barbaric? To even begin to understand, we have to put our own morality aside and step into the brutally pragmatic reality of the Viking Age. Theirs was a world of razor-thin margins. One bad harvest or one harsh winter could mean starvation for the entire family. There were no social safety nets, no modern medicine, no resource surplus. Survival was a daily calculation of energy spent versus resources gained. In this cold, hard world, infant exposure wasn't seen as an act of malice, but as a desperate form of resource management. What future would a child with a severe disability have in a society built on intense physical labor? In a world without specialized care, they would require constant attention, draining the family's precious time and food. A family might have to choose between feeding one child who could never work and feeding the healthy children who could. The same grim logic applied to healthy babies born during a famine. If the food stores were almost empty, bringing another mouth to feed could put everyone at risk. The horrifying choice to expose one infant might be the only way to ensure the survival of its parents and older siblings. It was a choice between a certain death for one and the possible death of all. The power of this decision rested with the male head of the household, reflecting a patriarchal society focused on legacy and resources. Female infants were sometimes exposed as well, likely driven by a preference for sons who could inherit land and become warriors. This wasn't done lightly. The sagas hint at the sorrow involved. It wasn't about a lack of love, but about love being overruled by the overwhelming need to survive. The practice was so ingrained that Christian missionaries later found it one of the most difficult pagan customs to eliminate. The genius here isn't kind or gentle. It's the genius of a battlefield surgeon performing triage, making impossible choices to save as many as possible. It's the ruthless logic of a people clinging to survival. By making the brutal choice to cull the weakest or the unsupportable at the very start of life, they ensured their limited resources went to those with the best chance of growing up strong and contributing to the clan. It was a heartbreaking and, to us, indefensible practice. But in the unforgiving world of the Vikings, it was a logical solution to the constant threat of extinction. Imagine a dispute in the Viking Age. Maybe a man accuses his neighbor of stealing a cow, or maybe an insult is thrown, a challenge to a man's honor that can't be ignored. Today, that would mean lawyers and courtrooms. In the Viking world, there was a faster, more direct, and much more brutal solution: the holmgang. The holmgang was a legally sanctioned duel, a trial by combat used to settle all sorts of disputes. This wasn't a street fight, it was a formal, ritualized event. A public challenge was issued, and the duel would happen a few days later. Anyone could challenge another man over property, debt, or most importantly, honor. Refusing a challenge meant being declared a nidinga, a word for a coward and social outcast, a fate many considered worse than death. The rules were set. The fight might happen on a small island or a marked-out piece of land to keep anyone from running away. Each man got a set number of shields. They would take turns striking. In its early form, a holmgang was a fight to the death. The winner not only proved his point, but often got to claim the loser's property. Later on, it became more civilized, sometimes ending at first blood. This sounds like a recipe for chaos, right? A legal system based on who's better with a sword. It seems like the very definition of might makes right, a brutal system where the strong could legally rob and murder their way to the top. And yet, the holmgang wasn't about creating chaos. It was about containing it. Its brutal appearance masked a genius social function: to provide a final, decisive end to conflicts that could otherwise explode into devastating, multi-generational blood feuds. You have to remember, Viking society had no police force to enforce laws. Justice was a community affair, and honor was the currency that held it all together. An unresolved insult or a broken promise could spiral out of control, pulling in families and clans, leading to revenge killings that could destabilize an entire region. The holmgang was a pressure valve. It took a widespread conflict and trapped it in a small circle on the ground. It isolated the fight to the two people involved and provided a clear, final resolution. Win or lose, dead or alive, the matter was settled. It was a way to short-circuit a blood feud before it could even start. This idea of controlled, strategic violence extended to something even more infamous: the blood eagle. According to later sagas and poems, this was a horrific ritual execution for the most hated enemies. The victims' ribs were supposedly severed from their spine and their lungs pulled out through their back to create a pair of bloody wings. Now, scholars fiercely debate whether the blood eagle was a real practice or just a literary invention by Christian writers to make the Vikings look like monsters. We'll likely never know for sure. But whether it was real or myth, its story served a powerful purpose. The genius of the blood eagle isn't in its gruesome details, but in its function as a tool of terror. If it was real, It was an extreme form of public violence designed to send an unforgettable message, cementing a ruler's authority and terrifying any potential challengers. An execution this horrific would be talked about everywhere, creating a reputation that was a weapon in itself. Even if it was just a story, it was an effective one. The tales of the Blood Eagle helped build the Viking reputation for ferocity. That reputation did half the work for them, sowing panic long before their ships ever hit the shore. So, from the formal duel to the legendary horror of the Blood Eagle, the Vikings used violence in a calculated way. It wasn't just mindless savagery, it was a system of social control, dispute resolution, and psychological warfare, perfectly adapted to a world where a fearsome reputation was a vital tool for survival. The brutality wasn't the point, it was the means to an end, and that end was order, not chaos. Picture the menu at a Viking feast. You might be offered harkarl, chunks of Greenland shark that have been buried to ferment for months, then hung to dry, giving off an ammonia smell so strong it'll make your eyes water. Next to that could be svid, a boiled sheep's head, wool singed off, eyeballs staring blankly from the plate. For your daily meal, you could look forward to gritty porridge and dried, salted fish that's as hard as a board. To our modern palate, the Viking diet sounds unappetizing at best and downright disgusting at worst. It seems monotonous and stomach-turning, a cuisine born of pure desperation. We imagine them lacking fresh vegetables and relying on foods that sound more like a dare than a meal. But dismissing the Viking diet as primitive is missing the point entirely. It was, in fact, a masterclass in food science and preservation, perfectly engineered to fuel a demanding lifestyle through some of the toughest seasons on Earth. The things that seem gross to us were the keys to their survival. The cornerstone of this diet was preservation. Summer and autumn were times of abundance, but winter was long, dark, and frozen. To survive, everything had to be preserved, and the Vikings were masters of it. They smoked, dried, and salted their food. Fish, a staple rich in protein, was hung on racks and dried by the cold sea wind until it became stockfish, a food so durable it could last for years and was perfect for long voyages. Now, let's go back to the infamous harkarl, the fermented shark. There's a very specific genius behind this. The Greenland shark is plentiful in the North Atlantic, but its flesh is toxic when fresh, full of a natural antifreeze that would poison you. Through trial and error, the Vikings developed a unique detoxification process. They buried the shark in a gravelly pit, which pressed out the toxic fluids and fermented the meat over several weeks. Then it was hung to dry for months. The result was not just edible, but a high-energy food packed with protein and fats, perfect for winter. Harkarl wasn't a punishment, it was a brilliant scientific solution. Their everyday diet was also more balanced than you'd think. They grew hardy vegetables like cabbage, onions, peas, and beans, and foraged for wild greens and vitamin-rich berries. Porridge was a calorie-rich superfood, the perfect fuel for a long day of farm labor. Dairy was another pillar. They had cows, goats, and sheep for milk, which they turned into butter, cheese, and skyr, a high-protein food similar to yogurt that's still popular today. Nothing went to waste. That boiled sheep's head, or svid, represented a philosophy of using every part of the animal, providing nutrient-rich meat and fat. The Viking diet was the ultimate expression of pragmatic nutrition. It was a high-fat, high-protein engine designed to power them through cold weather and grueling work. What seems brutal to our taste buds was a stroke of culinary and scientific genius that let them conquer the North. In our popular imagination, the Viking world seems like a man's world. We picture women as passive figures at home, or worse, as prizes won in battle. From this angle, Viking marriage looks brutal and transactional, a contract between families where a woman was basically property passed from her father to her husband. And on the surface, some of that is true. Marriages were often strategic alliances to combine wealth and power. They were more like business mergers than love stories. The sagas are full of fathers arranging marriages for their daughters to seal a peace treaty or gain an ally. This seems like another example of a brutally male-dominated society. But if you stop there, you miss one of the most radical and brilliant parts of Norse culture. While getting married might have been a transaction, a woman's position inside that marriage was astonishingly powerful and independent for the time. A married Norse woman was not her husband's property. She became the manager of the entire household, a role with huge authority. The symbol of her status was a ring of keys she wore at her belt. These weren't for show. They symbolized her control over the farm's food, finances, and the family's wealth. When her husband was away raiding or trading, often for months or years, she was the undisputed boss. She ran the farm, managed the money, and made all the decisions. She was running a complex business. This status was backed up by law. A woman could own and inherit property. While sons were favored, she always kept ownership of her dowry, the wealth her family gave her at marriage. This gave her an economic independence that was almost unheard of in other parts of medieval Europe. But here's the most startling proof of a Viking woman's power: her right to divorce. At a time when marriage was a permanent sacrament in Christian Europe, Norse society was much more practical. A woman could divorce her husband for many reasons: if he was a bad provider, if he was neglectful, or if he was violent. A husband striking his wife was grounds for divorce. To get one, a woman just had to declare her intention in front of witnesses. Upon divorce, she had the right to take back her full dowry and often a share of the couple's property. This financial security made divorce a real, viable option. In fact, a 10th century Arab traveler who visited a Viking trading town wrote with shock and amazement that women there had the right to divorce their husbands whenever they wanted. So, the genius of the Viking marriage system was its deep pragmatism. By giving women real authority and legal rights, Norse society made itself more stable. With men so often away, they needed strong, capable, and empowered women to keep everything running. Giving them the power to run farms, own property, and leave a bad marriage wasn't about modern feminism. It was a brilliantly practical solution for their society. The brutal arranged marriage was actually a framework for a partnership that recognized and protected the vital role of women, making them not just wives, but essential pillars of the Viking world. So we've journeyed past the stereotype of the mindless berserker. We looked beyond the fire and fury and into the homes, families, and laws that shaped their world. And what we found wasn't simple brutality. It was a complex and often brilliant pragmatism forged in the fires of a harsh reality. We saw it in their smoke-filled longhouses, which weren't primitive huts, but sophisticated machines for living that warmed the family and preserved their food. We faced the difficult truth of infant exposure and saw it not as casual cruelty, but as a desperate form of triage, a ruthless calculation to ensure the family's survival. We saw that the violent Holmgang duel was a clever way to prevent society from collapsing into endless blood feuds. We learned that a diet of fermented shark wasn't a punishment, but a triumph of food science that fueled them through the darkest winters. And we found that behind their arranged marriages was a system that gave women surprising power, making them not property, but partners. In every case, a habit that looks brutal at first glance reveals a hidden layer of genius, a hard-won wisdom that allowed the Vikings not just to survive, but to dominate. Their solutions were often harsh, sometimes heartbreaking, because their world demanded it. The Vikings teach us that genius isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's rugged, practical, and born from pure necessity. They were not just barbarians, they were brilliant survivors. Their story is a powerful reminder that context is everything and that true ingenuity often wears a brutal disguise. If you were fascinated by the hidden logic of the Vikings, you won't want to miss our next video where we explore more of history's most misunderstood figures. So be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. And let us know in the comments which Viking habit you found the most surprisingly brilliant. The history of Viking conquerors, how the elite lived. A sword dripping with the spoils of war. A longship cutting through the icy sea. That's the Viking we all think we know. But what if I told you the true measure of a Viking lord's power wasn't just the terror he caused on the battlefield? What if it was the silent authority he held from his high seat in a smoky hall? What if the greatest conquerors of the Viking age won their power not just with an axe, but with a handshake, a plot of land, and a carefully poured horn of mead? Forget the raider for a moment. We're about to uncover the real story of the Viking elite and how they truly lived. The Viking age. It immediately brings some powerful images to mind, right? Fierce warriors, masters of the sea, bursting out of Scandinavia to raid, trade, and settle across Europe and beyond. Their stories, the sagas, are filled with epic battles and a serious thirst for glory. But that popular image, while not totally wrong, is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. It focuses on the action and the violence, but it overlooks the very foundation of Viking society: power, wealth, and the complex social ladder that held it all up. The people at the very top of this world, the kings and powerful nobles we know as jarls, were so much more than pirates. They were the aristocracy of the North, the 1% of their time. Their lives weren't just one raid after another, but a careful balancing act of politics, economics, and social climbing. To really get the Viking age, we have to look past the front of the longship and into the heart of their world, the great halls, the huge estates, and the busy trade hubs they controlled. This is the story of how the Viking elite actually lived. It's a story not just of plunder, but of property, not just of fighting, but of feasting, not just of conquest, but of control. We'll explore where their immense wealth came from, which often had more to do with a good harvest than a bloody battle. We'll step inside their amazing longhouses, the centers of their political and social power, and we'll discover a world where your status was written in the fine silks you wore, the intricate jewelry that you flashed, and the lavish parties you were expected to throw. This is the untold history of the Viking conquerors, a look at the lives they led when the fighting was done, in the halls of power where legacies were truly made. First things first, to really get the Viking elite, we have to update our definition of a conqueror. The most powerful men in Norse society were the jarls, a noble class of chieftains who were second only to kings. In the early days, a guy might become a jarl through his skill in battle. But as Viking society got more complex, the role of the jarl changed from a simple war chief into a sophisticated political operator, a regional boss who was one of the real power brokers of the Viking world. These men were the lords of the land. While a king might rule over a huge, sprawling territory, it was the jarls who handled the day-to-day business of power. They ran specific regions, sometimes for a king, but often with a whole lot of independence. This setup, with power spread out, was exactly what you needed in an age of exploration and settlement. It allowed for things to actually get done locally across the massive Viking world. A jarl's power wasn't just about how many warriors he could call up for a raid. It was measured by the size of his lands, the loyalty of his people, and his influence in the community. Sure, he was a military commander who had to train and equip his own personal squad of bodyguards, known as a herd. But he was also a manager and a judge. Jarls had to keep the peace, collect taxes, and settle arguments in their territory. They even ran the local assemblies, called the Thing, which was the democratic heart of Norse society, where laws were made and justice was served. To do that, you needed more than just muscle. You needed wisdom and a deep knowledge of Norse law. So, the most successful Jarl wasn't always the most brutal raider. He was the most strategic leader. He was a politician, navigating a messy web of alliances and rivalries. He was an economic powerhouse, and he was a pillar of the community who understood that real power wasn't just built on fear, but on generosity, honor, and respect. Being good at fighting was definitely part of the job description, but it was just one tool in a much bigger toolbox. The real conqueror was the one who could win a battle, but also manage a farm, seal a trade deal, and command loyalty long after the swords were put away. The real source of wealth and status in the Viking world wasn't a chest full of silver. It was the ground beneath their feet. Land ownership was everything. A jarl's influence was directly tied to how big and how productive his farms were. The richest lords owned huge areas of land, sometimes dozens of farms that were all worked by other people. These lands produced a steady flow of everything from grain and cattle to timber and iron, and that was the economic engine that paid for their fancy lifestyles and political games. Most Vikings were free farmers called carls who worked their own land, but many others were basically tenants on a jarl's estate. They worked the land and paid him in food and goods. This system created a very clear social pyramid, with the landowners at the top, supported by the work of everyone else. At the very bottom were the thralls, or slaves, often captured in raids or just people who fell into debt. Thralls did the hardest labor on the farms and had no rights at all. So, a jarl's life was deeply tied to the rhythm of the seasons. While they were off leading raids or playing politics, a huge part of their job was just making sure their lands were well managed. They needed good harvests, healthy livestock, and a steady production of resources. A successful lord was a prosperous lord because that wealth translated directly into power. It meant he could feed his huge household and his warriors, have extra to sell, and throw the huge parties that were so important for his reputation. This connection to the land was more than just business. It was about identity and legacy. A jarl's estate was his kingdom in miniature, a physical symbol of his power. We often imagine Vikings as constantly at sea, but for the elite, life was rooted in the soil of their homeland. They weren't nomads, they were landlords. The loot from a raid might fill a treasure chest for a season, but the steady wealth from a well-run estate could keep a family in power for generations. While land was the stable foundation of a jarl's power, the elite didn't put all their eggs in one basket. They actively grew their income through a smart mix of trade, tribute, and, of course, plunder. The Viking Age was a time of incredible economic energy, and the elite were sitting right in the middle of it, controlling how goods and wealth moved across huge distances. Viking merchants were some of the best of their time, and powerful jarls and kings often controlled the most important trading towns and routes. Their amazing longships could handle both the open ocean and shallow rivers, which let them build trade networks that stretched from North America all the way to the Middle East. They sailed down the rivers of Russia to connect with the Byzantine Empire and the rich caliphates of the Arab world. From the north, they shipped out valuable stuff like high-quality furs, timber, honey, amber, and walrus ivory. And in return, they brought back the luxury goods that were the ultimate status symbols for the elite. We're talking fine wine from Germany, glassware from France, and exotic treasures like shimmering silks from China and Byzantium, gems from India, and massive amounts of silver coins from the Arab world. The fact that thousands of Arab coins have been found in buried hoards across Scandinavia tells you everything you need to know about how profitable this trade was. Tribute, or taxes, was another big income stream. Jarls and kings collected payments from the people living on their lands, which guaranteed a steady flow of resources. This system cemented their authority and gave them the money to pay for their soldiers and run their territories. And then there was raiding. The popular image of Vikings sacking monasteries is definitely based in reality. These raids were a direct and brutally effective way to get rich quick, especially when it came to precious metals, weapons, and slaves. For a young warrior, a successful raid was one of the best ways to build your own wealth and reputation. A leader who brought his men home loaded with loot would see his influence skyrocket. But it's better to see raiding as just one part of a larger economic plan. The shrewdest leaders understood that real, long-term wealth came from a combination of all three: the steady income from land and taxes, the big profits from trade, and the high-risk, high-reward jackpots from raiding. The heart of a Viking lord's world was his home, the Great Longhouse. These weren't just houses, they were giant billboards advertising your power, wealth, and social status. They were the center of political, social, and family life. The size of your longhouse was a direct reflection of your standing. An average family might live in a house that was 15 to 50 feet long, but the halls of powerful jarls, they could stretch for over 250 feet, completely dominating the landscape. Built mostly from timber, with walls of wood, turf, or stone, these long buildings were masterpieces of Norse engineering. They had these signature curved roofs, kind of like an overturned boat, that were designed to handle fierce winds and heavy snow. Inside, the huge open central hall was the main event. A long rectangular fire pit ran right down the middle, providing light, warmth, and the place for all the cooking. Smoke just found its way out through a hole in the roof. This central hall was where everything happened. It's where the Lord, his family, and his personal bodyguard of warriors, the herd, all gathered. Benches lined the walls, used for sitting during the day and sleeping at night. The most important people, of course, got the best seats. The Jarl himself would hold court from a high seat, a throne-like chair that was a clear symbol of his authority. From there he'd entertain guests, hold meetings, and settle arguments. For the elite, the Longhouse was a crowded, bustling place, home to not just the immediate family, but also their warriors, servants, craftsmen, and any visitors who might be passing through. And in many of the biggest longhouses, one end was even walled off to shelter valuable livestock during the winter, a practical design that also used the animals' body heat to help warm the place up. But more than just a home, the longhouse was a public stage. This is where political alliances were sealed, war strategies were planned, and justice was handed out. It was a workshop where all sorts of crafts took place, especially during the long, dark winters. And most importantly, it was the venue for the grand feasts that a lord's reputation was built on. The Longhouse was a symbol of the Jarl's power to protect and provide for his people, a place of community that stood as a giant monument to his success. Inside that smoky longhouse, no event was more important than the feast. These were not just big meals, they were powerful political events that were absolutely essential to how Viking society worked. Throwing a great party was one of the best ways for a lord to show off his wealth and generosity, two things that were cornerstones of his honor and authority. If you could provide tons of food and drink for your followers, it was a clear sign that you were a successful leader. Feasts could be held for all sorts of reasons: to celebrate a successful raid, a wedding, a religious festival like Yule in the winter, or just to strengthen the bonds between a chieftain and his people. These parties could go on for days. The long tables would be piled high with food that was way better than the everyday stuff. Roasted and boiled meats were the main attraction, with pork being a special favorite, along with beef, lamb, and game like deer and wild boar. There was plenty of fish, and vegetables like cabbage and onions were served on the side. Of course, a key part of any good feast was drinking, a lot of drinking. Ale was the common beverage, but the real prestige drink was mead, a strong wine made from honey. Drinks were served in fancy horns or cups, and the act of toasting, known as the sumbel, was a serious ritual. Toasts were made to the gods, to the memory of famous ancestors, and to the health of the Jarl. This was also the time for making big promises, bragging about your accomplishments, and declaring your loyalty. The feast was also where you got your entertainment. Professional poets, called skalds, would recite epic poems about heroes and the great deeds of their host, basically acting as a living history lesson and a PR agent all in one. There was music, storytelling, and games, all creating a lively atmosphere that brought the community together. Even where you sat was a map of the social order. The most honored guests sat closest to the Jarl, while people of lower status were further down the hall. A feast was like Viking society in miniature, a place where power was put on display, loyalties were locked in, and the community came together under the roof of their leader. It was politics with a full belly and a raised drinking horn. In a society with a very clear pecking order, showing off your wealth and status was incredibly important. For the Viking elite, your clothes, jewelry, and weapons weren't just functional. They were a way of telling everyone around you who you were and where you stood. You could spot the difference between a Jarl and a regular farmer from a distance. While a common farmer wore practical, plain-colored wool, the elite could afford finer fabrics and bright colors. Dyes were expensive, so colorful clothing was a clear sign of wealth. Blue and red were especially popular. The richest of the rich could even get their hands on silk, an unbelievably precious material imported from places as far away as China, which they would use for trim or hats. Fancy embroidery and woven patterns also made the clothes of the rich stand out. Jewelry was maybe the most powerful status symbol for both men and women. They wore it proudly, often in layers, and it was made from bronze, silver, and gold. High-status men and women wore ornate brooches to fasten their cloaks, with the size and material shouting out their wealth. Arm rings and necklaces were a huge deal. Often made of heavy, twisted silver or gold, they weren't just decoration. They were a form of wearable money. A Jarl could reward a loyal warrior by giving him an arm ring, or even by literally hacking a piece off a larger one. Elite women wore incredible jewelry that showed off their family's wealth and their own power in the household. Strings of colorful glass beads, amber, and precious stones were common. A pair of large oval brooches were a signature piece of a high-status woman's outfit, used to pin the straps of her dress. And finally, a warrior's weapons were also a billboard for his status. While most Vikings had an axe or a spear, only the wealthy could afford a finely made sword. These swords were often status symbols in themselves, with handles beautifully inlaid with silver and copper. They were passed down through generations or given as gifts of high honor. From the color of their clothes to the weight of the silver on their arms, the Viking elite made sure their power was always on display. The children of Viking Jarls weren't left to have a normal childhood. From a very young age, they were groomed for a life of leadership and responsibility. Their upbringing was basically a training program designed to give them all the skills they'd need to keep their family on top in a very competitive world. For boys, military training was everything. They learned to ride horses, handle a sword and shield, and fight as a team. This wasn't just about self-defense. It was about preparing them to lead men in battle, a basic job requirement for any future chieftain. They learned strategy and tactics, not just from drills, but from listening to the stories of their fathers and the skalds, who told tales of great battles and heroes. But it wasn't all about fighting. An elite son also had to learn how to govern. This meant understanding Norse law so he could run the local thing assembly, settle arguments fairly, and manage the resources of a huge estate. They were taught how to play the dangerous game of politics, making alliances with other powerful families and securing their spot through both strength and smart negotiating. While they didn't have schools, literacy in the form of reading and carving runes was an important skill. Strategic thinking was sharpened through board games like Hnefatafel, a game of tactics that was like a Viking version of chess. The education of elite girls was also very specialized. They learned all the skills needed to run a huge and complicated household, which was a kingdom in itself. But their education also included politics and property. They needed to understand inheritance laws and how to manage the estate, because they'd often be left in complete charge for months or even years while their husbands were off trading or raiding. A good marriage was a cornerstone of political strategy, and an elite woman was expected to be a capable and influential partner. For the children of the elite, their entire childhood was preparation for the high-stakes game of power they were born into. Despite the stereotypes of a male-dominated warrior society, women of the Viking elite held a surprising amount of power. While men held the formal titles of command, high-status women had a degree of freedom and authority that was pretty amazing for the time. They were not passive figures stuck in the home. They were matriarchs, landowners, and strategic partners who were absolutely vital to the success of their families. The main domain of an elite woman was the great longhouse and the estate. She was the husfreyja, the lady of the house, and that title came with real authority. The keys she wore hanging from her belt weren't just for show. They were a powerful symbol of her control over the household's valuables, including the locked chests of food, textiles, and silver. When her husband was away, which could be for months or years at a time, she took over complete management of the entire estate, and that was a huge job. It meant overseeing the farm, managing servants and slaves, and making sure the entire community survived and thrived. Viking women also had significant legal rights, much more than women in many other parts of Europe. They could own property, inherit land and wealth, and even run their own businesses. And critically, they had the right to divorce. A woman could decide to end a marriage and take back her dowry and any property she brought into it, giving her a level of financial independence that was exceptionally rare. These women were also key players in the political games of the elite. As mothers, they raised future leaders. As wives, they were often trusted advisors. Their marriages were frequently strategic alliances between powerful families, and their ability to keep the peace and mediate arguments was highly valued. The famous Oseberg ship burial, one of the richest Viking graves ever found, held the remains of two high-status women. They were buried with unbelievable wealth, including a magnificent ship and luxury goods, which is a clear sign of the power and prestige they held in life. The women of the Viking elite weren't just behind the throne. They were often the very foundation it was built on. Life at the top of Viking society came with incredible perks, but it was also a life on a knife's edge. It was full of danger, pressure, and huge responsibilities. The power and wealth of a jarl weren't guaranteed. They had to be constantly defended and maintained. Central to a leader's life was the idea of honor, or doma. This was basically your reputation and the legacy you would leave behind. Protecting your honor was job number one. An insult couldn't be ignored, and a challenge had to be met. This often led to violent blood feuds between families, which were a necessary part of a social code where your reputation was everything. A leader who looked weak would quickly lose the respect of his own men. The political world was treacherous. A jarl was constantly maneuvering, balancing his loyalty to a king with his own ambitions and his rivalries with his neighbors. Alliances were fragile and could change overnight. A lord had to be a smart diplomat, good at making friends through gifts and parties, but also a ruthless strategist, ready to jump on a rival's weakness. Power struggles were common, and a jarl who let his guard down could lose everything. And leading your men in battle wasn't a job you could delegate. A jarl was expected to be on the front lines with his warriors. This was how he proved his courage and rewarded his followers with loot. A big win would cement his authority, but a major defeat could be a disaster, costing him not just land and wealth, but the loyalty of the very men sworn to protect him. Finally, there was the constant pressure to provide for his people. A jarl's followers expected to be well rewarded for their loyalty. This meant good food, plenty of drink, nice clothes, and a share of any treasure. Generosity wasn't just a nice to have, it was a political necessity. A lord who was seen as stingy or whose lands weren't doing well would find his warriors drifting off to serve a more successful and generous leader. The life of a Viking conqueror was a precarious balancing act. The high seat was a place of great honor, but it was never a place of rest. So, the world of the Viking elite was a far cry from the simple picture of axe-wielding barbarians. The great conquerors of the Norse world, the powerful jarls and kings, were complex people playing a sophisticated game of power, and that game was played in the feasting hall just as often as it was on the battlefield. Their lives show us that real, lasting power is built not just on force, but on a foundation of wealth, strategy, and social influence. Their incredible riches came from a smart, diverse portfolio. The steady, generational wealth from their huge farms, the globe-spanning profits of trade that brought silks and silver to their homes, and the brutal, high-stakes jackpots from raiding. This wealth was put on display for everyone to see in their colorful clothes, their heavy gold and silver jewelry, and most of all, in the sheer size of their longhouses. These incredible halls were the center of their universe, the headquarters of political power, the hub of social life, and the stage where they performed their authority every single day through huge feasts and strategic generosity. Life for the elite was a demanding balancing act. It required the skill to lead warriors into a shield wall, but also the brains to manage a massive farm. It demanded the cunning to navigate a web of shaky alliances, and the constant need to defend one's honor in a world that valued reputation above all else. By looking beyond the longship and into the longhouse, we find a much richer, more interesting story. It's a story of shrewd politicians, strategic landlords, and global traders who understood that power had many sides. The legacy of the Viking conquerors isn't just written in the stories of the lands they raided. It's also found in the remains of their grand halls, the foreign coins buried in their soil, and the epic sagas that tell of a society built on a complex dance of wealth, honor, and power. If you found this look into the hidden world of the Viking elite interesting, do us a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. What part of the elite Viking life surprised you the most? Let us know down in the comments. We really do read all of them. When you think of modern Sweden, you probably think of IKEA, meatballs, and a serious commitment to peace, and for good reason. For over 200 years, they've been one of the most famously neutral countries on Earth. A nation known for progressive social policies, minimalist design, and a quiet, unassuming presence on the world stage. But what if I told you that this peaceful nation has a secret, violent past? That for over a century, this tranquil Scandinavian country was one of the most aggressive and feared military powers in Europe? What if I told you that for a time, they built an ambitious overseas empire with fortresses and colonies stretching from the shores of America to the coast of Africa? This isn't some alternate history. This is the real, forgotten story of the Swedish Empire. A time when Swedish armies redrew the map of Europe, when Swedish kings made emperors tremble, and when a small, sparsely populated kingdom on the edge of the world clawed its way to greatness. This is the story of how Sweden conquered the world, and then lost it all. So, to understand how a nation of barely 1 million people could come to dominate its neighbors, you have to get the picture of the world they were born into. For centuries, Sweden was basically the underdog of Scandinavia. It was overshadowed by the wealthier and more powerful Denmark, and was a pretty poor, rural and isolated kingdom. Most of its people were farmers and miners, just scraping a living from the thin soil and deep forests of the north. Worse, Sweden wasn't even fully independent. It was the junior partner in something called the Kalmar Union, which bound Sweden, Norway and Denmark together under a single Danish king. For the Swedish nobility, this was a deeply frustrating setup. All their influence and wealth was being siphoned away to Copenhagen. Rebellions were common, but they were always crushed. It really seemed like Sweden was destined to be a permanent backwater. But that was about to change. The spark was a man named Gustav Vasa. In the 1520s, after the Danish king massacred a group of Swedish nobles, Gustav led one final successful war of liberation. He shattered the Kalmar Union for good and, in 1523, was elected king of an independent Sweden. Gustav Vasa was the true father of the Swedish state. He was ruthless, clever, and a total visionary. He centralized power, crushed the old nobility, and then, in a move of pure political genius, he broke with the Catholic Church. By embracing the Protestant Reformation, he didn't just align Sweden with the rising powers of Northern Europe. He also got to seize the Church's enormous lands and wealth, filling the royal coffers for the very first time. He laid the foundation for a modern state, creating a bureaucracy, a tax system, and the beginning of a real national identity. But even with all of Gustav's reforms, Sweden was still poor. Its greatest resources were copper and high-quality iron ore, but it didn't have the cash or the know-how to really exploit them. The solution came from a wave of skilled immigrants, especially the Walloon Dutch merchant Louis de Geer. He and others brought advanced industrial techniques that would turn Sweden's raw materials into military and economic power. Suddenly, Sweden wasn't just producing iron, it was producing the best cannons in Europe. Still, a strong economy and a unified state weren't enough. To be a real power, Sweden needed an army to match. For that, it would have to wait for Gustav Vasa's grandson, a man who would not only perfect the Swedish state, but would forge it into the most lethal military machine of its age. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, and he would become known as the Lion of the North. When Gustavus Adolphus took the throne in 1611, he inherited 3 different wars at the same time against Denmark, Russia, and Poland. Not a great start for a 17-year-old king. Sweden was surrounded, its resources were strained, and its existence was on the line. But where others saw a crisis, Gustavus saw an opportunity. He saw that the old ways of war, with their clumsy, slow-moving formations of mercenaries, were totally obsolete. He imagined a new kind of army, and over the next decade, that's exactly what he built. Gustavus Adolphus is rightly called the father of modern warfare, and his reforms were revolutionary. He created a national standing army through conscription, which meant his soldiers weren't just fighting for pay. They were fighting for their king and country. He professionalized the officer corps and standardized all their equipment. But his real genius was on the battlefield. He introduced light, mobile artillery that could actually be moved around during a fight, a huge change from the heavy, static cannons everyone else was using. He trained his cavalry to charge with sabers instead of the old, ineffective tactic of riding up, firing pistols, and riding away. Most importantly, he perfected the idea of combined arms. His infantry formations were smaller and more flexible, mixing musketeers and pikemen in agile units that could deliver devastating waves of fire, all while being supported by that mobile artillery. The Swedish army became a perfectly coordinated instrument of destruction, unlike anything Europe had ever seen. The testing ground for this new army was the single most destructive conflict in European history before the World Wars, the 30 Years' War. It started as a religious fight between Protestants and Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire, but it quickly spiraled into a political struggle for control of the continent. By the late 1620s, the Protestant side was on the verge of collapse. The Catholic armies of the Habsburg Emperor were winning everywhere, and it looked like all of Germany would fall under their control. This was a direct threat to Sweden. A Habsburg-controlled Baltic would strangle Swedish trade and leave the kingdom totally vulnerable. So, for both religious and strategic reasons, Gustavus had to act. In the summer of 1630, with just over 13,000 men, he landed in northern Germany. The Catholic commanders just laughed at this snow king, thinking he and his tiny army would melt away before the might of the empire. They were about to learn a brutal lesson. On September 17, 1631, the Swedes met the main imperial force at the Battle of Breitenfeld. The Imperials were a massive traditional army. The Swedes were smaller, more mobile, and more flexible. At first, the battle went badly. The Swedish allies from Saxony broke and ran, but as the Imperial cavalry charged what they thought was a collapsing flank, they ran straight into the disciplined firepower of the Swedish brigades. The Swedish line held, reformed, and counterattacked. Gustavus's mobile artillery hammered the dense Imperial formations, and his cavalry smashed their flanks. By the end of the day, the supposedly invincible Imperial army was annihilated. Breitenfeld was a thunderclap that echoed across Europe. In a single day, Gustavus Adolphus had shattered the myth of Habsburg invincibility. He became a legend, the Lion of the North. For the next year, he marched his army across Germany, conquering a vast swathe of the Holy Roman Empire. It seemed like nothing could stop him, but his incredible rise came to a sudden, tragic end. On November 16, 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, Gustavus led a cavalry charge into a thick fog of gunpowder smoke and rain. He got separated from his men and was cut down behind enemy lines. The Lion of the North was dead. His army, enraged, fought on with a terrible fury and won the battle, but the soul of the campaign was gone. The death of Gustavus Adolphus could have been the end. The country was now technically ruled by his 5-year-old daughter, Christina. But the system that Gustavus and his chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, had built was strong enough to survive. Oxenstierna took over the war effort, and for another 16 years, Swedish armies kept fighting across Germany. When the war finally ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Sweden was one of the big winners. It was granted huge territories in northern Germany, including western Pomerania and the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden. These weren't just pieces of land, they were strategic ports and river mouths that gave Sweden control over the rich trade routes of the Baltic and North Seas. Sweden was now officially a European great power. The Stormaktstiden, the age of great power, had begun. The second half of the 17th century was the absolute peak of the Swedish Empire. The dream of Dominium Maris Baltici, dominion of the Baltic Sea, was now real. From Germany to Finland to Estonia, Sweden controlled almost the entire Baltic coastline. The sea had basically become a Swedish lake. Tolls and taxes from the great trading ports of Riga, Revel, and Stettin poured into the Swedish treasury, funding the state and its giant army. The monarch at the start of this era was Queen Christina, the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus. She was brilliant, fiercely intelligent, and a huge patron of the arts, determined to make Stockholm the Athens of the North. She invited scholars from all over Europe to her court, including René Descartes. But she was also unconventional. She had no interest in the normal duties of a monarch. She refused to marry, and her lavish spending nearly bankrupted the state. Then, in 1654, she did something that stunned Europe. She abdicated. She secretly converted to Catholicism, the very faith her father had died fighting against, and moved to Rome. The crown was left to her cousin, Charles X Gustav. Charles X was a completely different kind of ruler. He was a warrior, just like his uncle Gustavus Adolphus. He saw Sweden's new power not as something to protect, but as a launch pad for more conquest. His main targets were Sweden's old rivals, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark-Norway. In 1655, he launched a massive invasion of Poland known as the Deluge. Swedish armies swept across the country, capturing Warsaw and Krakow. But the campaign got bogged down in a brutal guerrilla war. Seeing its chance, Denmark-Norway declared war on Sweden, hoping to get its old territories back. This was a fatal mistake. In a move of incredible audacity, Charles Thacks marched his army out of Poland, across Germany, and straight to the Danish border. He arrived in the middle of one of the coldest winters on record. The sea between the Danish islands had frozen solid, something that almost never happens. After his engineers tested the ice, Charles made a legendary decision. In late January 1658, he marched his entire army, cavalry, artillery, and infantry, across the frozen sea. The Danes were in total shock. Their islands, which they thought were impenetrable, had just been invaded on foot. The Swedish army showed up at the gates of Copenhagen, and the terrified Danish king had no choice but to surrender. The treaty that followed was the high point of the Swedish Empire. Denmark was forced to give up a third of its territory, including the southern tip of modern-day Sweden. The Scandinavian peninsula was now almost entirely under Swedish control, but there was a fatal flaw at the heart of this empire. Sweden itself was still a poor country with a tiny population. Its great power status was built on the temporary weakness of its neighbors and the strength of its army. It had been punching above its weight for decades, but it couldn't last. The empire was a magnificent beast, but it was being sustained by a heart that was too small for its colossal frame. All it would take was for its neighbors to recover, to modernize, and to unite. And in the final years of the 17th century, that's exactly what happened. While all this drama was unfolding in Europe, Sweden, like every other ambitious power, tried to carve out a piece of the wider world. Its colonial adventures were a fascinating, if ultimately unsuccessful, sideshow to the main event, but they show the sheer scale of Sweden's global ambitions. The first and biggest venture was in North America. In 1638, 2 ships sailed up the Delaware River and established Fort Christina, the first European settlement in the area, right at the site of modern-day Wilmington, Delaware. The colony of New Sweden was always small. Unlike other colonial powers, their relationship with the native Lenape people was mostly peaceful and based on trade. But the colony was always on shaky ground. It was underfunded and caught between the expanding Dutch and English colonies. In 1655, the powerful Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant sailed a fleet into the Delaware and forced the Swedes to surrender. New Sweden lasted just 17 years, but it left a lasting mark, introducing the log cabin to America. Around the same time, Sweden also turned to Africa, founding the Swedish Africa Company. In 1650, they established a trading post on the Gold Coast, in modern-day Ghana. They built several forts, the most important being Fort Carolusborg, which would later become the infamous Cape Coast Castle. For about a decade, Sweden took part in the brutal Atlantic slave trade, but just like in America, their position was weak. In 1663, the short-lived Swedish Gold Coast was conquered by its rivals. Even after the main empire fell, the colonial impulse flickered back to life. In 1784, Sweden acquired the Caribbean island of Saint Barthélemy from France, which it held for nearly a century before selling it back. And for a little over a year, from 1813 to 1814, Sweden even held the large island of Guadeloupe, a reward for helping defeat Napoleon. Ultimately, these overseas ventures were just footnotes. Sweden didn't have the population, wealth, or naval power to compete with giants like Britain or France. But they're a crucial part of the story. because they show that Sweden's ambition wasn't just regional, it was global. The Lion of the North didn't just want to rule the Baltic. It dreamed of a Swedish flag flying on every continent. By the end of the 17th century, the power dynamic in Northern Europe was changing. In Russia, a new Tsar was on the throne, a man of boundless energy and brutal ambition with a clear vision to modernize Russia and get access to the Baltic Sea. His name was Peter the Great. He, along with a revived Denmark and a vengeful Poland, saw that the Swedish Empire was stretched thin. They saw a boy on the Swedish throne, the 15-year-old Charles XII, and they smelled blood. In 1700, they formed a coalition and declared war, attacking Swedish territories all at once. They expected an easy win against a teenage king. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Charles XII was maybe the most extraordinary figure the Swedish Empire ever produced. He was a pure military prodigy, a warrior king who lived for war. Instead of waiting to be overwhelmed, Charles launched a series of lightning-fast counterattacks. First, he turned on Denmark, landing his army right outside Copenhagen and forcing them to surrender in just a few weeks. Then, he sailed his army to Estonia, where a massive Russian army was besieging the city of Narva. With just 8,000 men, Charles attacked the Russian force of 40,000 in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. The result was one of the most stunning victories in military history. The Russian army was completely routed. Having humbled Denmark and Russia, Charles spent the next 6 years chasing the King of Poland all over Eastern Europe, defeating his armies and putting his own puppet king on the Polish throne. By 1706, Charles XII was the master of Northern and Eastern Europe. He had defeated all his enemies. Peter the Great even offered to return all his conquests for peace. This was Charles's moment. He could have accepted, secured the empire, and gone down in history. But Charles XII only knew total victory. He refused the offer. He declared he would only negotiate with the Tsar in Moscow. In 1707, at the head of a massive army, Charles XII began his fateful invasion of Russia. It was a disaster from the start. Peter the Great used Russia's greatest weapons, its size and its winter. As the Swedes marched deeper into the vast, empty plains, the Russians retreated, burning everything. Swedish supply lines failed. Then came the Great Frost of 1708 to 1709, one of the coldest winters in European history. Thousands of Swedish soldiers froze to death. Their army was being bled dry without a single major battle. Desperate, Charles turned his starving army south towards Ukraine. Peter intercepted them. On July 8, 1709, near the town of Poltava, the two armies finally met. The Swedish army was a shadow of its former self, down to around 20,000 exhausted and starving men. The Russian army was now a modern, well-equipped force of over 40,000. The Battle of Poltava was the death knell of the Swedish Empire. The Swedish attack was brave but hopeless. Overwhelmed by superior Russian artillery and sheer numbers, the once invincible Swedish army was annihilated. Charles XII managed to escape and fled into exile in the Ottoman Empire. The news of Poltava electrified Europe. The anti-Swedish coalition reformed instantly. Denmark and Poland re-entered the war. For the next decade, the war raged on. Charles finally made a dramatic ride back to Swedish territory in 1714 to lead the defense of his crumbling realm. He fought on with grim determination, even invading Norway in 1718. It was there, during a siege, that the story ends. On November 30th, 1718, while inspecting his troops, a bullet struck him in the head, killing him instantly. With the king's death, the will to fight finally broke. The Great Northern War ended with the Treaty of Nystad in 1721. The terms were brutal. Sweden was forced to cede its Baltic provinces to Russia. Its German possessions were lost. The dream of Dominium Maris Baltici was over. The Baltic Sea now belonged to Russia. The Swedish Empire was gone. The collapse of the Swedish Empire was just as swift as its rise. In 2 decades, it went from the dominant power of Northern Europe to a second-rate state. The reasons for its rise were clear: visionary rulers, a modern state, key resources, and a revolutionary army. The reasons for its fall were just as clear. It was an empire built on an unsustainable foundation. It just didn't have the population or the economy to compete with rising giants like Russia. The constant warfare drained it of men and money, and in Charles XII, it had a king whose brilliant but reckless ambition led it straight off a cliff. The loss of the empire was a deep national trauma. After a century as a conquering power, Sweden was forced to look inward. The era that followed was called the Age of Liberty, where the Swedish parliament seized power, blaming the absolute monarchy for the disaster. A new foreign policy emerged, one based not on conquest, but on survival. Over time, this evolved into the famous Swedish neutrality we know today. So, the peaceful, non-aligned Sweden we see now wasn't born from some natural disposition to pacifism. It was forged in the fire of imperial collapse. It was a direct reaction to the glorious, bloody, and ultimately catastrophic era when Swedish armies conquered the world. If you found this secret history fascinating, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of the past. And let us know in the comments, what other peaceful nation has a surprisingly violent history you'd like us to uncover next? Thanks for watching.